This week, I've been working on another in depth article, but this one has to do with one of the most destructive relationship patterns that many of us at some point in our life, if not repeatedly, find ourselves caught up in. And even if it doesn't pertain directly to you, if it's not part of your personal experience, it certainly does to friends and family members and probably lots of people that you know. And this article is entitled, and so is the video, Like a Hurricane. It's talking about the incredibly destructive push pull dynamics that some of us find ourselves entangled in. Some individuals, because of their emotional wounding, that have this inability to be fully present in a relationship. They're so conflicted internally that they can't just show up. For the longest time, I just assumed that everyone has these most basic needs to love and to be loved. But sometimes the emotional wounding that people carry overrides that. And it can have especially destructive consequences if you're on the receiving end of it, but also if you're one of the individuals who reenacts that push pull dynamic. I'm Ben Ufana, and do look below, click like and subscribe. And also, I would encourage you to read the more in depth article. We're living in an age of shorts and reels and TikToks, and where people have the attention span to watch a one or possibly a few minute video and then they click off. Sadly, that's making a lot of us into idiots because it takes a sustained attention to really gain an in-depth understanding of the various issues that are impacting us in our lives. So anyway, there's so much in-depth content. So again, read the more in-depth article. And because there's so much in this article, I'm going to be referring to my notes, possibly reading some sections of it because it's just too much to remember. But in any case, let's dive in. So many of us have found ourselves entangled in these relationships where we meet someone and it feels like we have this amazing connection. And some of these individuals can be so enticing. There's just something about them. We feel we have this connection. And then they start to withdraw. They begin to distance from us. And sometimes there's even uh, anger on their part. And it could be so destabilizing because many of us who do operate with these basic needs to love and be loved, we want that stability. We want that constancy or consistency. But there's quite a few people, because of their emotional wounding, they lack that capacity. They're not able to show up fully present and the way that we need someone to be there for us. And for those of us, when we find ourselves entangled in a relationship with someone who's doing this destructive push pull dynamics, it can leave us reeling, especially if we are already struggling with these deep emotional wounds of abandonment and rejection. And the intensity of these relationships have this way of triggering our deepest fears of being unlovable, and all the while creating this storm of confusion and anxiety and emotional turmoil that can be incredibly difficult to escape. Now, I feel it's critically important for those of us who find ourselves getting entangled in these kinds of relationships to understand that those individuals who we form attachments to, who are enacting these very destructive push pull dynamics that we get ensnared in, they're often not fully conscious or cognizant of what it is they're doing. All of us, to some degree, we're all emotionally wounded in one way or another. And the fact that we've never learned to work constructively with our emotions, that when emotions are distressing are painful or uncomfortable in any way, we tend to push them down, to disconnect from them, to distract ourselves. I think it was Carl Jung who initially said, neuroses is always a substitute for legitimate suffering. And so, generally across the board, when people suppress emotions or disconnect from them or distract themselves, numb themselves, what happens is there's a way in which we enact certain behaviors instead of being able to heal the wounds and resolve the issues and conduct ourselves in a way that is somewhat more sane. We tend to enact various dysfunctional dynamics, and that applies in all areas of our lives. And so, what happens is because of this profound emotional wounding, often stemming from their own childhood experiences, the relational dynamics with their own mother and father, maybe past experiences and relationships in their adult lives, it creates this profound emotional instability. And there's often a tremendous fear of intimacy. So these individuals, what often happens is they crave intimacy or closeness, but they feel overwhelmed when things get too intense. And to protect themselves, what they often end up doing is pulling away. But that leaves those of us who truly want that connection, want that intimacy, feeling confused and hurt and insecure and anxious and desperate for answers. And their fear of vulnerability shuts them down emotionally. So, in turn, on the other hand, back to us, it leaves us stranded in this emotional wreckage of their withdrawal. And one of the most damaging or even devastating aspects of this cycle is when it ends up with them ghosting us or this outright abandonment. And after weeks and months of this push pull where we're getting jerked back and forth and all this emotional turmoil that it's creating for us, what often happens is they completely disappear and we're left with no closure, all these crazy, unsettled feelings. And it can be extraordinarily painful. It feels like emotional annihilation. It's like the connection that we once cherished, it's replaced with this profound void. And again, we're left with all these unanswered questions, endless heartache, and the sting of rejection. The real danger of these relationships for so many of us is that they become an incredibly destructive form of addiction. The emotional highs of the closeness are so powerful, so potent, and we begin to crave them like a drug. And the fact that there's the uncertainty and that they're pulling back at times and distancing, and we get these little hits of affection and attention, and then they're distancing again. And when they do, when they cut us off, the lows that we experience can be unbearable. A lot of individuals who enact this kind of push pull dynamic can be quite charming, and their presence draws us in. But just as quickly as we feel like we're connecting with them, we're pushed away. And that distancing and sometimes even that anger they end up directing at us at the point that they're pushing us away, it's painful. And but these relationships keep us on a constant emotional roller coaster. It's this whole mix of exhilaration and devastation. We're feeling alive and connected one moment, and then we're left reeling when they pull back. It's like being caught up in a violent, destructive storm. In this case, the destruction is to our well being. We're left feeling disoriented and desperate as these moments of closeness are often followed by the painful withdrawal, leaving us constantly navigating the emotional highs and lows and feeling out of control. Years ago, when I was growing up, there was a song that often played on the radio, and I didn't really comprehend its significance. A song by Neil Young, "You Are Like a Hurricane." And his talking about his experience of being swept up by someone, that powerful, uncontrollable storm that you find yourself swept up in. And it captures the experience of being in a relationship with someone who is so emotionally unstable. And there's something about the emotional push-pull cycle of being in one of these relationships that mirrors the unpredictability of a very chaotic and even violent storm, again, leaves us feeling disoriented and desperate for stability, and we're caught up in this exhausting loop of closeness, followed by withdrawal, which ultimately erodes our sense of control and our emotional well being. One of the things that happens is whenever these individuals, like I said, they're drawing us in, we feel what seems like love or affection or connection with someone. But as they begin to pull back, and it's triggering those profound fears of abandonment, the anxiety, the insecurity, and it leaves us scrambling. We're trying to understand what's wrong. What did I do wrong? We're trying to regain that sense of closeness that we once felt. And the unpredictability just keeps fueling or escalating our fears of losing this person entirely. And the emotional chaos just keeps pulling us deeper into a perpetual cycle of self doubt and desperation. And even more so, the relentless push pull cycle creates an emotional addiction where the unpredictability keeps us hooked, much like a drug addict needing their fix. And the emotional highs, I mean, those rare moments of calm and closeness, they become so intoxicating, even though the lows that follow are absolutely devastating. And so we start craving these brief periods of peace and connectedness, like the calm before the storm. We're just hoping to feel secure. We're wanting to feel loved again. And each time we experience that fleeting connection, it feels like reward, making the emotional turbulence that follows even harder to escape. And the more we chase those highs, the more we become trapped in this cycle, unable to break free of the destructive pattern. The problem is we remain trapped in this destructive cycle of the constant highs and lows. It erodes our self-esteem, and it makes us question our worth, to question whether we are even worthy of being loved. And the emotional exhaustion of constantly trying to regain the closeness that we crave drains our energy, it leaves us depleted and overwhelmed. And as the storm passes, what's left is this inability to trust, both in ourselves and in future relationships. As the emotional wreckage lingers, it makes it difficult for us to rebuild, leaving us hesitant to open up, fearful that we're going to be hurt again. A very important thing to understand here is that this push pull dynamic is not specific to either gender. It could be enacted by both men and women. And people with insecure attachment styles, such as anxious, avoidant, or disorganized, are far more likely to enact these kinds of push pull relational dynamics. And this behavior often stems, as I mentioned earlier, from early childhood trauma, fear of intimacy, or a deep fear of rejection. And it's especially common with those who struggle with emotional regulation. Those who have unresolved emotional pain are more likely to exhibit unpredictable behavior in their relationships, leading to the back and forth cycle of closeness and withdrawal. Also, when it comes to being on the receiving end of this crazy making relational dynamic, men and women are equally vulnerable to getting caught up in this emotional push pull cycle. Anyone could fall into the trap. And those of us who have unresolved attachment issues, low self esteem, are drawn to the intensity of the highs and lows that these relationships create. As I started to mention earlier, many of those who enact these crazy making push pull dynamics in relationships are carrying this profoundly deep emotional wounding, much of which originates from the relational dynamics or experiences they had with their parents or caregivers. And these wounds shape attachment issues, and they create an emotional instability, which later manifests in terms of how they engage in their adult relationships. And children who grow up with inconsistent or unpredictable caregiving, where their emotional and physical needs are sometimes met but often neglected, are more likely to develop what's called an anxious avoidant attachment. Their caregivers might provide love and attention one moment only to become emotionally unavailable the next. As a result, these children learn that relationships are unreliable. And this instability creates a deep insecurity and fear of abandonment. As adults, they carry this pattern into their relationships. They often have a strong desire for connection, pulling us in with their charm and affection, but then withdrawing and pushing us away when the emotional intimacy feels overwhelming. And this behavior becomes their way of managing their own fears: fear of rejection, fear of vulnerability. Their need for closeness is often overshadowed by the terror that will eventually hurt or abandon them, which leads to this erratic push pull cycle. And if they were deeply hurt, neglected, and emotionally abandoned by their caregivers, they may grow up associating intimacy with danger. And while they crave love and affection, they fear getting too close because it opens them up to potential emotional harm. The push serves to protect them from getting hurt, while the pull happens when the fear of being alone becomes stronger than the fear of intimacy. And as I mentioned earlier, so many of us were carrying this profound emotional wounding, all these highly charged emotions: fear, the hurt, sadness, maybe in addition, a lot of these traumatic experiences that we've lived through. And so, in the process of connecting with another individual, where they would experience this intimacy, closeness, this connection, that's a very powerful experience. And for the most part, they're not fully understanding what's taking place, but by having this powerful experience of bonding with another individual, it has the effect of stirring up all these highly charged emotions and the impressions of these traumatic events that have been long held within the body. When that happens, even if they're not fully cognizant of what's taking place, they feel that discomfort and they immediately pull back out of an act of self preservation. The underlying dynamics of those who enact these push pull dynamics in relationships vary considerably. And yet, there are certain reoccurring qualities that contribute to the emotional chaos that these individuals create. Many of them are emotionally unavailable. They struggle to fully engage in intimacy, pulling back when relationships become too intense. Some of them are commitment phobic, or they may exhibit a hot and cold personality alternating between affection and detachment, which leaves those of us on the receiving end feeling confused and destabilized. Some have narcissistic tendencies, using the push pull behavior as a way to manipulate or maintain control. And they may shower their partners with love and attention, often referred to as love bombing, only to withdraw or devalue them, causing emotional turmoil. Falling in love with someone who's enacting these kinds of push pull dynamics in a relationship can result in profound emotional devastation, as their unpredictability can cause immense turmoil within us. The emotional roller coaster begins with the moment of intense closeness and affection, making us feel valued and connected. However, this connection is shattered when the push pull partner suddenly withdraws, triggering a cycle of hope that's followed by rejection. And this constant oscillation creates a powerful emotional dependency where we become addicted to the fleeting highs of connection as we brace for the inevitable emotional withdrawal. Over time, this push pull dynamic erodes our self esteem. We start to believe that we're not enough. And we internalize the idea that our worth is somehow tied to this individual we formed an attachment to and their unpredictable affection. And we blame ourselves for the other person's withdrawal. We begin to feel unworthy and makes it harder for us to assert our needs, our boundaries in these relationships. And this leads to a deep and profound insecurity and constant anxiety as we're trying to please our partner while feeling increasingly inadequate. The mental and emotional exhaustion that's caused by this kind of dynamic is overwhelming. We become hyper focused on the relationship, this person we formed an attachment to. We're analyzing every interaction, trying to make sense of it, trying to understand why our partner pulls away, why they're jerking the fuck out of us emotionally. It leaves little room for our own needs, our well being. And this emotional hypervigilance often results in anxiety and depression and a sense that we're constantly walking on eggshells. We fear doing something that's going to push our partner further away. As we become more emotionally dependent on this individual, we may isolate ourselves from our friends and family, feeling too drained to connect with others, too embarrassed by the toxicity of our relationship. And some of us fall into this pattern of talking with anyone we can get to listen to us, trying to make sense of the crazy of this person that we formed an attachment to. And understandably, people often get sick of hearing it. So often we end up holding that pain inside and we become more isolated, and the isolation deepens our emotional reliance or dependence on the person that we form this attachment to. And we feel increasingly disconnected from our support system. And over time, we end up losing sight of our identity outside the relationship. We're trying to maintain our self worth based upon this crazy making person's fleeting affection. Those who ensnare others and these push pull dynamics are so addictive because of the psychological concept of intermittent variable rewards or intermittent reinforcement. And this occurs when affection and attention and love are given unpredictably, much like the mechanics of gambling. The unpredictability of these emotional rewards makes them far more compelling, and it keeps us constantly on edge, craving more, even when the relationship is harmful. And the power of this unpredictability is that we never know when the next moment of closeness will come. And that just intensifies our emotional responses to them. And these sporadic moments of affection intensify our craving for connection, making each positive interaction feel all the more significant. And over time, we become emotionally dependent on the few high moments to offset the painful withdrawal periods, which mirrors the highs and lows of addiction. These intermittent variable rewards triggers the release of dopamine, the brain's feel good chemicals, as well as oxytocin, the bonding hormone, in each burst of affection. And again, these moments of affection become the emotional reward, reinforcing the sense of connection and making the relationship feel like an emotional lifeline. These neurochemical surges intensify our desires for closeness, making the highs all that much more addictive. And even though the lows are so devastating, we become trapped in the cycle of emotional craving and withdrawal, chasing those fleeting moments of pleasure and connection. This dynamic creates the illusion of progress. We believe that if we just keep trying a little harder, we hold on a bit longer, the relationship will somehow magically all work out. The illusion keeps us hooked, even when it's clear that the pattern is toxic. The emotional roller coaster is so disorienting that we end up chasing these fleeting moments of validation, reinforcing our low self esteem in the process. Breaking free from this addiction requires recognizing the dynamic for what it is, an emotional trap fueled by inconsistent affection. Understanding that these moments of closeness are not a sign of genuine love, but a part of a destructive pattern is the first step in reclaiming our emotional health and self worth. And it's not just our emotional health that we need to be concerned about. The chronic stress from these push pull relational dynamics activates our body's fight or flight response that can lead to insomnia, digestive problems, fatigue, immune system suppression, and a host of other disastrous health consequences. Another aspect of this trap that I should mention is because of the power of these kinds of relational dynamics and how they hook us, is that many of us fall into this trap of seeing this individual because we're feeling so intensely, so powerfully for them. We get this feeling like, this is the one. I found my soulmate, even though their behavior is so unpredictable and damaging. At the same time, we also have this tendency to see their instability and somehow think that we could rescue them. We convince ourselves that if we just get together, that our love will somehow magically heal their deep emotional wounds and that we'll live happily ever after once we get together. It's all an illusion. It's not going to happen, and there's nothing you can do to heal these individuals. Like so many other people, I got caught up in a few of these relationships and the push pull dynamics, and it was absolutely devastating for me. In my mid to late 20s, I was working with a psychotherapist, and I'm not blaming her in any way, but she possessed a limited understanding of this kind of dynamic because there wasn't a lot of literature available at the time. There wasn't much understanding. And so it left me in many respects on my own. I had to figure out my own way out of this incredibly torturous relational dynamic. One of the things I found myself doing when I would form these attachments to such an individual is that I would try and keep trying to make the relationship work. And it would finally blow up on me. And I'd be left with these extraordinarily painful emotions, the devastation. I'd be left in the ruins or the wreckage, and I'd have to piece myself back together. And even before it got to that point, there was all this excruciatingly painful emotion. But there are several things that I found very helpful. Instinctively, I taught myself to dive into the depths of the pain. I would acknowledge what I was feeling. And sometimes I found it very helpful to picture that individual, to bring them to the forefront of my awareness, to see her, to feel her presence. And I would notice what I was feeling. I couldn't help but notice it, but I would center my awareness in the depth of those feelings and breathe very softly, very deeply. And I would follow those feelings as they went through their progression. The pain I was feeling would often intensify to the point where my entire body was consumed with it, and it would be excruciating at times. But there would be a certain point at which it would break open, and I could feel the pain coming out of my body in waves. But I would just keep breathing. And underneath that pain, I would often feel these profound emanations of warmth that would begin to emerge from within. As a result, I felt a stronger connection with this authentic core of my being and also with the higher power. This was the important part of breaking those unhealthy, toxic attachments. Other times, I would just breathe with my awareness centered deep within my chest cavity. Many of us hold an enormous amount of hurt going back to childhood. Whatever we went through, either with our parents or caregivers or other important people in our lives, the long history of relationships that many of us have gone through where we experience whatever hurt or rejection or whatever painful relational drama we suffered through. Also, I would center my awareness deep within my abdomen at times. What I found is by going deep into the abdomen, like down into the intestines themselves, I'd breathe into the physical sensations, into the emotions that arose. And that helped to take me to a much deeper level, going deep into the core where a lot of these patterns that we enact in our relationships originate. It also had the effect of helping me to ground much more firmly into my body. So many people who get stuck in these obsessive relational dynamics, our problem is that we're just not that firmly rooted in our bodies. We're somewhat dissociated, and it makes us more susceptible or prone to getting strung out on someone like a drug addict needing their fix. I need to backtrack just a bit and that to say that many of us get into trouble because of our lack of understanding. And so we need to develop a deep and thorough understanding of our emotional wounding, of our history, of our relational dynamics, of the dysfunction of our family of origin, our own individual dysfunction. And so I would encourage you to the best of your ability, gain that cognitive understanding. In doing so, you're able to recognize, at least have that cognitive understanding of the relational dynamics or the patterns that you're enacting in your relationship. And with that being said, there are limits to what we can do with cognitive understanding. Cognitive understanding alone will not heal the deep emotional wounds. You're not going to just figure it out intellectually and, okay, now I got it. Everything's cool now. It's all healed. No, that's not going to work. You need to go much further. So, in addition to doing practice and the practices that I just mentioned a few moments ago, I encourage you to do practice on a daily basis. I do the meditation practices that I've shared. It facilitates the deep level processing of both your lived experiences and the highly charged emotions. I feel we all need to be doing at least a good hour of intensive daily practice. Working with these meditation practices, you could also do Qigong practice, but a lot of people are resistant. It's foreign or inconceivable. And yet you go into these other ancient traditional cultures, and it was a normal thing for people to be doing hours of intensive daily practice. For me, training with the master from China, having spent time in India, Sri Lanka, these other cultures. Yeah, it was a typical thing. Spending time with Buddhist monks, spending time with Indian sadhus or gurus, other people who had developed to an extraordinarily high level, these individuals who do hours of intensive daily practice to attain mastery. And the fact that if you're not doing practice, you're probably going to be strung out, you're going to be reeling and wasting all kinds of time. Again, being strung out and you're pining about that individual, that you've gotten yourself entangled. So if you're doing practice, you're doing something constructive with your time. It facilitates your healing and continued growth. But in addition to practice, as I said, it's important to be making use of the most powerful therapeutic interventions. Some of the interventions I found to be most effective for healing the emotional wounding that will help you to dissolve those unhealthy attachments, to build a stronger and healthier foundation, to transform the emotional wounding that caused you to get entangled with these individuals who enact these really toxic push-pull relational dynamics. Deep tissue body work. We store much of the emotions, these painful emotions, the traumas that we live through, they're stored in our bodies. You're doing lots of deep tissue body work, and it breaks loose a lot of this emotion as the emotion comes up into your conscious awareness, and you work with the practices that I'm sharing with you. Breathing from the depth of all those emotions, it helps you to digest them, makes you more grounded, and it helps to free you by dissolving those unhealthy attachments. It helps you to evolve to a place where you're forming healthier, more meaningful connections. The sessions that I did with gifted healers were also especially helpful because it was helping me to digest the highly charged painful emotions, to digest those earlier traumatic experiences, and to build a healthier foundation from which and if you get to work with a gifted healer such as myself, it helps to build the foundation through which you could form the healthier, deeper, more fulfilling, more meaningful connections. There are very few people working on this level, very few gifted healers at this day and age. And because of that, the fact that I spent years training with a traditional Native American doctor, a medicine man, a big part of the training that I went through involved what's referred to as the vision quest, where I would go out the 4 days and nights alone in the mountains to fast without food and water. During the vision quest, there are times I feel this extraordinarily powerful presence descending into my body. There are parts of the vision quest, it feels like a near-death experience. And all of these past traumas, and even some of the more recent at that time, dramas that were playing out where I was really suffering in these relationships. It's all coming up. I'd be reliving these experiences, be flashing through my mind rapidly. All the highly charged emotions would be coming up. And I could feel this extraordinarily powerful presence helping me to digest both the lived experiences, all the highly charged emotions, and at the same time, it was helping me to build this much healthier foundation through which I can form more meaningful connections. And gradually, I did begin to attract partners in my life and establish those healthier connections. Those who have the opportunity to work with me individually experience a very similar healing process. It's taking those lived experiences, the grief, all this overwhelming fear of abandonment, the sadness, the rejection, all the emotional torment. You're digesting that. It's transforming, transmuting that. You come out the other side, you're letting go of those unhealthy, disastrous attachments. Many people that I've worked with attract people into their life with whom they experience these deeply meaningful and fulfilling connections. So, by all means, if you're struggling with these patterns where you've gotten yourself entangled with someone who's jerking you around, creating all this enormous pain and insecurity and the fear of loss and abandonment, do reach out to me, work with me individually, because it's a profound opportunity for you to heal these patterns and to create, again, that foundation through which you could experience much more meaningful and deeply fulfilling connections. Reach out to me. I do work with people individually. Thank you for joining me. Again, if you haven't done so already, look below, click like and subscribe if you're seeing this video on YouTube. Thank you again for joining me. Bye for now.